This video is a brief overview of positional content. The aim of positional content is to map the relationship between an image and some content, and as part of this we've built a high fidelity content authoring tool for previewing and building content. So here is an example of editing content using positional content, and we've also set up an example page to show the output. In this example we have two items, a text-based item and an image-based item. So I'll start with the text-based item, and we can go in and edit this. So I'll just add more to the top there, and it previews, and then if I save this, the output will be updated as well. And then I can move this item down to the side and preview the output, and it's moved. I can also fine control the item's position by using the Dimensions tab. You'll notice that positional content stores item positions as percentages, and this is very important when working with responsive positional content, which we'll show you in a later video. So if I can go in and change the top position, then it changes on the preview, and change it to 20% there, and it updates there. So I'll show you around the image based. So if I go into the image, I can change the image. I can also change the image's size in relation to the underlying image, and I can preview and go and preview this. I'll move on to the cropper now. So the developer defines the image required on the site by its width and height, and as a result its aspect ratio, which is the shape of the cropper shown. The content author then supplies an initial image and uses the cropper to cut out the image crop that will be used on the site. When this image is larger than the size of the defined output image, then the content author can zoom in and out to provide further control of what image is created, but they can never zoom in under the minimum crop size, so there should be no loss in quality of the final image produced, and I can show you an example of that now. So and there's your output. From here I'll show how the process starts by selecting the background image. Note that the image that is picked needs to be at least the size of the crop defined in the property editor settings that I'll show later on. This is in place to maintain fidelity and prevent poor quality output. So I'll select the image. And that's the entire process. This is an example of the property editor in positional content for the example content that we saw earlier in the video. In this property editor for positional content, we can define the content and settings for the items and the image. This gives great control to developer and content editor. We have added settings as a separate definition because this allows global styles that are independent of the content. As a simple example, we've used these settings to allow the content author to revert a piece of content from black to white to match the image behind. Here we can see that only the item content data type is defined. The data is actually defined in nested constant instances, and the drop-down list displays all nested constant data types that are set up for the site. This makes it really easy to define the full content for positional content whilst take advantage of the ease of use of nested content and as a result document types. So I can show you that now. If I go to the positional content items, and these are the document types that we saw earlier on for the positional content item text and positional content item image. And if you wanted to add more, then you could just add a new document type and add it to nested content, and it would automatically get added to positional content, all the positional content instances that use this instance of nested content. So if I go back to the positional content simple image and move on to breakpoints. So breakpoints allow you to define the crop width and height, and you can use these responsively, which I'll show you in a separate video. But here, as we saw earlier on, when you're adding the initial image, then this defines the width and the height of the crop that's generated from positional content into the output. So there are other options here, but we won't get into them in this video. They're really well labelled. But we'll move on to the Visual Studio side of things now. So if I go into Visual Studio, so this positional content simple document type that we show and we've been using as an example throughout this video, this is the code behind it. We have generated a partial which makes positional content easy to use in this way. Of course, you're not limited to using this partial, and the model you can use it for any wish any need you have for it. The positional content partial is downloaded as part of the plugin install, and it appears within the partials folder. And I can give you an example of that now. So this is the file that's downloaded and that we're using for the example. And you'll note that there's two CSS files that we call on. One for the wrapper of positional content that sorts out the images and make sure that the container for the items is set up correctly, and then we have another dynamic CSS file that's generated depending on the crop sizes that's provided in the positional content property editor that we've just seen. So finally, how do you manage the previews of the items within the positional content editor? So just like the grid, we have when you download the plugin, we generate a positional content folder in here, and just like the grid, we've created a base partial file, which literally all it does is it works out all the document types, and it renders partial files in the same directory of the document type. So if you add a new document type to a nested content instance, then you just provide a file in here to render it out. We actually use this in the positional content partial as well to render it, so it's all seamless, and the same code is used for both the back office and the front office. So if I show an example of that, so very similar way to something like the Blender works, is we just pass in a view model, and you can pick it up there and get the settings or get the multiple items or the first item, and work it out from there and create the preview for it. The CSS doesn't need to sit here, but we have in this example to make it easier. So I can show you that on the front end as well, and in the back office. So if I go into the positional content item text and I change this to a red background instead of a white one, and then save that and go back to content, yep, and that's changed it there, and it changed it there. And this is the end of the video. We'll move on to creating a new video to show you the responsive parts of positional content and how we can use that to create images that and content that responds depending on the device that the client is using.